I was laying on the grass, gazing into the bright blue sky one afternoon, when I noticed two blackbirds close together above my rosebush full of tall white roses. I thought these birds were playing and fanciful, but upon closer inspection, they were hurting each other, dive-bombing, and pecking at each other. I couldn't help but think at that time in my marriage, this seems like marriage, always pecking at each other. We weren't always this way. We started out as avoiders, blissfully floating through the sky, unaware of what each other thought, when in truth one of us was deeply hurting and the other deeply resentful. So when hurting hurt too much and pecked first at resentful, resentful finally turned full height feathers and demanded, "Stop pecking on me!" Resentful knew this was not what God would have in marriage, being pecked on. But would God have resentful pecking back at hurting? Think about Jesus Christ. There were times in his life where he did not just take the pecking. He retorted back, "Ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, hypocrites, for ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead people's bones." Or Christ went silent. Or he only hung out with the people who he knew had a good spirit about them, who were receptive to his message. He had his way around the peckers. Marriage doesn't have to be a pecking. It can be a fun interplay mid-flight with new scenes and grand adventures with your one and only, with love pecks. As John Whittier Greenleaf says, "Thee lift me, I lift thee, and we'll ascend together." Come inside as we grow from contention to connection. Love Zone Marriage 10. Sinking to sinking in marriage. Conflict to connection. For one of our dates, my husband and I decided to canoe down a beautiful meandering river. I wanted to row the back where I was comfortable, and he would direct the front of the craft, which would at some point hit the rapids. Hee hee. Well, my husband and I both learned to paddle watercraft differently. He concentrated the power of the canoe in the front of the boat, and I leveraged movability power in the back, like reversing the oar stroke to make a sharper, quicker turn. Our first few whirls around bends of the stream were a little choppy. I declared to him, "We're going to get this yet, you and me." But it wasn't easy. At one point, I was about to be whipped by the brush on the side of the bend. I thought, what is my husband trying to do to me? He would do things differently if he knew what I was going through back here. By the end of the 4-mile stretch, I realized we definitely don't do things the same way. We had to work at keeping the canoe afloat and keeping ourselves from contention in the boat. More on that later. I once heard a story of a Navajo Indian recruited into the military during World War II. Other Navajo Indians dotted the world map as they used the Navajo language, relaying confidential wartime information from one Indian to another in an unfamiliar to the enemy language. In other words, they kept top secret information from entering the wrong hands because the Navajo language wasn't one the opposition understood. This Navajo man served the United States well in his capacity, but eventually found himself caught as a prisoner of war. He survived a Japanese prisoner camp for a year, then finally returned home to his Indian nation with an honorable release when the war ended. When the man returned to his tribe, the Indian chief looked into his eyes and saw the life gone out of them. The Indian chief ordered the warriors of the tribe, "Tie a rope around him and throw him into the lake." To the returned soldier he admonished, "You must fight for your life until your eyes come alive again." And that they did. The man struggled in the water until he wanted to live, which he finally did. How often do we look at each other in marriage with lifeless eyes, even square eyes, that shout, "Mayday! Mayday!" By understanding conflict in marriage and ways to resolve it, the light in our eyes in marriage can shine brightly once more, or even for the first time. And as for me, I choose to swim. We've talked about water, the Navajo sinking or fighting, and keeping a canoe on the water from sinking. So I'd like to tell you about a concept I've embraced in strengthening marriage. It is the concept of syncing, S-Y-N-C-I-N-G. To sync is to synchronize. Synchronizing in marriage is when you combine forces of spirit. You become one in mind and heart when you land on the same page. Okay, sometimes it's the same book. There's a better chance than not that you are understanding what's up with the other, why they feel as they do, and how to quickly connect one with another. Like syncing a device, pairing a device with another so information flows easily. If you felt like you were syncing, S-I-N-K-I-N-G, in marriage, like the Navajo intelligence serviceman upon his return, wouldn't it be wonderful to go from syncing with an I to syncing with a Y? Could it even be that syncing with an I is what eventually makes it possible to sync with a Y? We'll talk more about this in the next part as we talk about the value of brokenness. But for now, list 3 ways you sync in your marriage. And list 3 ways you'd like to sync, S-Y-N-C, in your marriage. Broken to restored. I remember a beautiful brick Victorian church building that sat close to the middle of our small town, and whenever I passed by it, I drooled at the arched stained glass windows. Yes, it had fallen into disrepair and neglect, and soon neighborhood kids were pitching rocks through these marvelous arched windows. Years later, a photographer with potential in his eye bought up the old church, replaced those beautiful arched windows, and created a lovely edifice for wedding celebrations. Photography included. We've all seen it, something in disrepair being restored to something wonderful. I once attended a retreat where we had an unexpectedly satisfying time of taking an issue that brought angst to our mind, then taking a hammer to a precious vase. Once shattered, we glued the vase pieces back together with a sparkly golden glue, talking about the issue that had brought us angst, giving it air while other listening ears helped us process the issue. Yes, mine dealt with marriage, and I can now tell you that this vase now sits with highest honors in my bedroom because it holds so much meaning to me about restoration, about the potential of making a not-so-great marriage more than great. But here's something interesting to me. Have you ever restored something or seen something in the process of restoration? I have never seen or been part of a restoration that didn't involve mess, and most often a lot of mess. If you replace a wall or a window in a house, if you work on a vintage heirloom to make it nice again, it involves a taking apart, a breaking away of the old, doing away with what isn't working to make it work. So you can think of it like this. If you restore the condition of a closet brimming with junk, you may find a lot of value in taking everything out, discarding or donating what no longer works in there, then replacing into the closet what does work. You may even purchase a new organizing system or shelving to create something even greater than before. The same can be true in marriage. What is brimming full? What needs restoration? And will it be messy? There's a good chance it will. I mention this so you don't anticipate a bed of roses as you work on your marriage, though I'm not saying that's not possible. And you might wonder if you're doing it all wrong, or if it will never work. Great things happen after the struggle, like a butterfly emerging after the struggle of its cocoon. So now let's talk about rebuilding, part of the restoration process. And we'll do so through the acronym REBUILD, R-E-B-U-I-L-D. So we begin with R, which is for responsibility. In a troublesome marriage, it's easy to not take responsibility for the hard things because it helps our spouse see how much we've been hurt or damaged. It feels good to hang on to grudges and gripes. Why clean that piece out of the closet if it serves us in getting what we want, in justifying our actions or experiences, and just calms our nervous system in vindication? It takes a strong and humble person to acknowledge they have responsibility in what is going wrong in a marriage. This refers to both sides. Both parties have likely done some part in withholding love. And if one party was truly not responsible at the root of conflict, if the other party is unwilling to make amends, the first party has every right to terminate the marriage. But I have seen marriages riddled with affairs and abuses take on a whole new energy and become something wonderful. Next letter, E, empathy, for each other. To hear and be heard is one of the most important parts of marriage. Empathy is deeply hearing someone else, from their viewpoint, not yours. This may require repeating what you thought they said and repeating their feeling words. B in rebuild. B is for building trust intentionally. If you have betrayed your spouse, it is your responsibility to help increase the level of safety and trust. I talk in Love Zone Marriage 7 course about how important safety is in a marriage union. Become highly willing and enthusiastic to honor as much as possible in what they request. Rather than seeing your spouse as controlling or too much, just see them as scared. If you have breached a marriage contract, you no longer have the right to be defensive around intentional actions that will help in your spouse's healing. Become willing and even excited to do whatever you can for them to feel safe and loved. You, understanding as to why conflict or betrayal has happened so it won't happen again. As Roger K. Allen, marriage therapist, says, don't let stuck feelings become the chronic way of living. Be open and honest and transparent. Allow understanding with empathy to become a profound learning and growth opportunity for both of you. I is for investment in the relationship and reprioritizing it. In order to heal in marriage conflict, it's important that you refocus your time and energy towards your relationship. It needs you right now, and there will never be a better time. Plus, the payoff will be tremendous. It's essential that you invest in your spouse so they feel wanted, special, and that they matter. That you choose them and do what it takes to choose them. Does this take some swallowing of pride and vindictiveness? Yes. But with investments, the greater the risk, the greater the return. And for cave people like me, and maybe you, this doesn't mean you have to always be there in your marriage. Sometimes we need a break, which is about keeping a sense of self, about differentiation, and healthy interdependence, co-regulating. L. Learn to love each other in fulfilling ways. Over time, it's so easy to stop doing the kind, loving, thoughtful, intentional things that show each other your love. You both likely have some significant emotional and/or physical needs that have not been met for a while. Get curious about what those are and how you can become a master at uniquely loving your spouse, how they long to be loved. As I always say, love in a way that works for you too. Marriage is about give and take, and learning to love is a process in knowing what works for both of you. And finally, the D of rebuild is design intentionally a thriving relationship moving forward. Consciously create a relationship moving forward where you both feel deeply fulfilled. This is an invitation to start anew and make things stronger and better than ever. Why just settle? Why accept the humdrum of a stale marriage? I remember the day I heard this bit of marriage advice. It may take until you are 90 years old to get marriage right. That's why we might live that long. In other words, give and expect grace for each other. You've got a while. Rebuilding a marriage can be like a reboot, cleaning out that closet, starting fresh, letting bygones be bygones. Do you know why a goldfish is the happiest animal on earth? It only has a 10-second memory. Even after the restoration, a wall is still a wall. A closet is still a closet. The Victorian church is still an old church. Spiders will crawl up the new wall. Muddy shoes will be thrown into the closet. The old church's pipes may leak. And so it is with marriage. With restoration comes the acceptance that life and marriage is not meant to always be happy. That would be boring and, quite frankly, pointless. We are here to learn and grow. A wonderful marriage doesn't make life easy or painless. It just makes the work sweeter and the pain more meaningful. The restoration more stunning and complete. Please understand that I'm not saying every marriage should stay together. But what if everything you are doing in marriage is so that you can have something more brilliant eventually? Like my cracked vase to the beautiful vase in the end. What if it's all in the process of becoming more in sync with your higher self because you haven't been allowed to be as selfish as you'd like, or get away with what you hoped, creating a lopsided dynamic? becoming something greater, more brilliant together because of the very cracks. Mature love. So I want to begin this part with a simple and fun assignment. Watch this little 1-minute video that is similar to how we might begin all smiles in marriage, only to experience eventual burdens and struggle. I laugh so hard every time I watch that video. Way back in Love Zone Marriage Course 1, I talked about the 5 stages of marriage, and that video illustrates this trajectory, at least the first part. We grow from, as you see on this diagram, footpath in marriage, 1, fresh, the newlywed stage, to 2, floored, the power struggle, to 3, functional, committed, to 4, friends, growth, and finally, 5, flourishing, thriving. The first year we are flooded with admiration, then it drops. Shortly after, we will be annoyed, irritated, and conflicted, floored in marriage, and that's normal and okay. It's what we do or don't do with it that matters. This phase is a bit like a toddler who always wanted mommy until they wanted their independence. Similarly in marriage, we are attached, enmeshed at first, then realize we still need that sense of self, but in a new dynamic. When we figure that out, we are functional, committed. We can do this thing. Then a nice place called friends. But marriage wasn't meant for friendship. It's a unique bond. 1 Corinthians 11:11 says, "Nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord." God intends the marriage union to strengthen us and synergize us in a way like no other way. He wants us to flourish, that highest point that continues upwards and onwards. I remember after I learned these 5 levels of marriage how I was stuck in an immature love, one that happens in the trench of this diagram. Did this mean I'm an immature lover? Well, yes, because a more mature woman would see the unromantic utilitarian dynamic I'd had and seek to bypass friends and become more prosperous in marriage, flourishing because in essence, I've grown up. I love better. Phew, tall orders. Mature love lets go of pride, control, unregulated emotion, and becomes balanced between the one up and one down. We both have equal, absolute value. We've prioritized, chosen, and see with new perspectives of what is and is not important. We accept and even cherish our differences, which makes marriage even more thrilling. We enjoy interests and activities together. We have deep appreciation and honor for one another. Our focus turns from getting, like someone who doesn't understand boundaries, to satisfying both. I am full enough to give because I am satisfied, maybe even in spite of them. There is more unconditional love, oneness, and unity. We don't avoid love or become too demanding. We belong together at a mutual middle place, at flourishing. So let's concentrate on how this might become so. But first, let's talk about the stumbling blocks, the boulders in the road of a satisfying marriage. Divorce and your part. Marriage and divorce in the literal sense. They say marriage is the end of all your problems, but which end? Who can say that in the fresh and meshed stage of marriage, as they ride off into the sunset, that marriage can be anything but blissful? But sure enough, we may dip down into that power struggle, the combining of 2 different personalities, lifestyles, expectations, trying to come together and work as a whole. So let me ask, what defines marriage? And what defines divorce? Can you be divorced while married? Google says marriage is the legally recognized union of 2 people as partners in a personal relationship. Marriage can also be defined as a combination or mixture of 2 or more elements. It says divorce is the legal dissolution of a marriage by a court. Divorce is also to separate or dissociate something from something else. I don't know about you, but I know several couples who are divorced but married. They are physically and emotionally separated or dissociated from each other. So, what do you think is the biggest reason for divorce? From money to parenting to communication issues and my favorite, irreconcilable differences. To the quieter ones, people often don't mention as their reason for divorce, like sex problems, which we'll discover in the next course, or the 3 A's of affairs and adulteries, addictions to like drugs, alcohol, pornography, gaming, shopping, food, or abuse. Tamara Frackrell, divorce and mediation attorney, speaks around the world about marriage repair and has divorced or uncoupled thousands of marriages. She says, 90% of divorces happen because of the 3 A's, addictions, adulteries and affairs, and abuse, anger management and immaturity in conflict resolution, health issues, including mental health, lack of regular intimacy, faith crises, finances, and, drumroll please, avoidance, with lack of communication as the number one cause of divorce. Not sharing what you really think or who you really are. Remember, those who aren't divorced doesn't mean they are happily married. They are married by law, but may be emotionally divorced. Having divorced or uncoupled thousands of marriages, Tamara Frackrell sees both sides of the effects of these 9 reasons she's noticed for a divorce. And this is what she has to say. Choose wisely. Marriage is hard. Divorce is hard. Choose your hard. Being financially disciplined is hard. Being in debt is hard. Choose your hard. Communicating is hard. Not communicating is hard. Choose your hard. I had to laugh when Frackrell said in her marriage class I attended, "It's cheaper to keep her," and she would know. Brendan Burchard says, avoidance is the best long-term strategy to ensure suffering. Avoiding conflict can be like a rug. You can keep sweeping things under the rug until it becomes a tripping hazard. So if avoidance of conflict is the number one reason for divorce, let's talk about that one. Because even fighting is avoiding conflict, through conflict. The conflict is not really getting to the core of the conflict, through ineffective fighting. People might avoid conflict because they think it's contentious, but conflict and contention are not the same thing. Conflict is at the root of every good story. Conflict, getting from point A to point B, from Kansas to Oz, from Jurassic World to the real world, from the village to the mountain filled with treasure. Conflict, obtaining an item, a ring, a guy, a magic elixir. Contention, on the other hand, adds darkness unnecessary for conflict. Evil witches, mad scientists, scary monsters, Voldemort. We add the darkness to make a realistic bad part of the story, but plenty of stories simply have conflict, which marriage can be as well. And done well in marriage, conflict becomes collaboration. Hearing about conflict-avoidant marriages eroding really encourages me to continue creating these classes. I went to a barbecue recently where I heard about 3 couples in town who I greatly admire and have been married for about 30 years who are getting divorces. Their avoiding conflict rug has become such a tripping hazard, they just call it quits and find houses for the both of them to seemingly start over with a new welcome mat, hopefully not to repeat the same patterns that recreate the tripping hazard. It sickens me. I see a family split apart. No family vacations, or family portraits, or neighborhood walks, or laughing at funny movies together, or Christmas mornings all together. No couple cuddling, sharing funny stories or memes, working in the yard together, having someone to share your deepest trials, your deepest dreams. The dissolution of the king and queen. Loneliness, isolation, bitterness, a dissolving, a dividing. I want to encourage others that marriage can be getting better and better. The triumphal continued union of the king and queen of your satisfyingly combined marriage. So here's an activity you can do starting tonight and lasting for as long as it is helpful. Ask yourself, how am I avoiding conflict? How am I adding contention to my marriage? What am I doing to create what I don't want in this relationship? Level 1. Record the answers to these questions at the end of the day, in a note app on your phone, on a pad of paper, whatever your way is. Level 2. Catch yourself during the day avoiding conflict, adding contention, or creating what you don't want in the relationship, so you don't have to report it at night at all. The heart of conflict. At the heart of avoiding conflict is the way we soothe ourselves, which is rather important in a marriage where one party goes to outside sources for that soothing and dopamine hit, whether it be adultery, where the emotional stakes are lower with the mistress, addiction to food, substances, gaming, porn, shopping, abuses, taking it out on someone else instead of facing the hard parts of yourself, emotional misregulation, relational immaturity, inability to connect, avoiding feelings and going to buffers instead. Isolation, being done with people, they are just too hard to manage. All of this avoiding conflict points to not wanting to step it up and actually falling to doing what is easier, not taking accountability. So at the heart of things that create divide in marriage is how to handle conflict and self-soothing well. It's incredibly difficult for those in their coping mechanisms to see what it's really doing to them. So let's talk about survival mode. Julian Ford, author of the book Hijacked by Your Brain, says, "There is an alarm center deep in our brains. When we are stressed, that alarm can essentially take control of areas in the brain that manage our memories and enable us to think clearly. For someone victimized by PTSD, that alarm is on high alert. Until it gets reset, the brain is stuck in survival mode, often causing the brain's memory and thinking centers to crash like a computer's hard drive, and resulting in persistent feelings of stress that seem unstoppable. Instead of exploring the world so that we can grow, develop, and engage fully in our lives, using the learning brain, the brain of a PTSD victim shifts to hypervigilance and a fight-flight state, a survival brain. We live in a stressful world. As I explained in Love Zone Marriage 7 on changing thoughts, remember that I generally include everyone in the stress category. Who do you know who is not addicted to something, even Diet Coke, or who suffers from depression or anxiety, or who doesn't buffer away problems through things they aren't proud of like shopping or pornography? These stresses become big T and little t trauma responses, from the big traumas like affairs and death, to the small t traumas like finding your child is using drugs or having a best friend move away. And as your stressors become greater, even the stress that you can't find your shoes or that you were charged a late fee. So I treat us all as being potential candidates of being in survival mode. Following is a list of indicators you live in survival mode, which I am happy to say, by the way, now seems foreign to me, though it once described my existence. Signs you are in survival mode. You are doing everything you can just to get through the day. You have focused all your energy on the next 24 hours. You are unable to even think about the next day, and never mind the next week. You can only consider one task at a time. Everything is urgent. You feel utterly alone and helpless. You are the only one who could do the job right, and you must do it yourself. You push others away without thinking because you don't have time or energy to deal with them. You don't eat properly, you don't sleep well, and your stress level is so high you feel like you're going to snap at any moment. You rush around like crazy but never get caught up. You can't remember the last time you laughed and enjoyed a day. All you can do is react to each situation that arises. Everything is reactive, not proactive. Do you identify with these, or even a few? There's a good chance you've been in survival mode, and our marriage partner can really add or help with this. At the heart of self-soothing in marriage is an element of safety. To have safety in marriage means being able to take care of yourself, to have a sense of self, to create the condition where you can become undefensive through understanding you are worth having more, that you have rights to be happy and full. Are you living up to your rights, to your potential, to have and give love? If you have done anything to damage trust and intimacy in marriage, you must work overtime to restore that trust. This is not a place of equal give and take. This is a cumulative gaining trust lost in the past. And you must apologize, expressing regret, accepting responsibility, making restitution, genuinely repenting, and requesting forgiveness. When done best, your first trust ultimately is in God. Even that can be tricky when you think you trust in God but give all your power to a spouse, whether or not they deserve it. And yes, I see it over and over. people giving power to their spouse but thinking they give it to God. Genevieve had just spent the weekend with her best friend from college and was walking through the airport on her return trip when she received the call from her husband, Jim. I messed up again. She recalls bursting into tears as she traversed the corridors of the airport to her car as she realized he'd been unfaithful in their marriage again. Her neighbors asked how her trip was as she walked from her car to her house, and she pasted on the smile and lied. Fine. This was becoming commonplace. Whenever anyone asked how she was doing, she would reply, fine. But Genevieve was not fine. She walked into the house where her 9 children awaited their mother and her happy return. But instead, they found a bitter mom pointing at their dad, ordering him to go live next door in his mom's basement. She was done putting up with his antics. In the course of the next several months, Jim would occasionally pop in for a visit to help set up the Christmas tree, while he instead sat the whole time on his phone. He helped the family pack for their extended family's annual winter camp, but didn't come along. He and Genevieve even held it together during their daughter's wedding reception. After realizing things were not improving, they met with a therapist who asked Jim and Genevieve to write letters to each other of what they expect of one another in marriage. Genevieve wrote, I remember when we used to feel so connected. You would tell me I'm pretty, you'd give me the greatest hugs, and sex was spiritual, even magical. We have felt so alive in the past, and I want the same again. Love, Genevieve. And here's Jim's letter. You've gained a lot of weight, and I'm no longer attracted to you. You need to lose 100 pounds before I come clean and come back. You need to become more loving, so I feel like I want to be in our home. Oh, and you need to be less of a hoarder. Jim. I love how Genevieve remembered the good about Jim, how she just wanted that goodness back in their marriage. And though we may frown at Jim's response, he was just following the assignment from his therapist. There's something going on with him, something he's not able to manage in himself, going outside his marriage sexually to make everything okay. There's a very good chance he doesn't want to go to infidelity, but he doesn't know what else to do to cope, to manage his life, to find satisfaction in ways that have worked in the past. He needs to level up. And it's not his wife's responsibility to follow through with his requests. Though, as we'll see in the coming section, there is a place where you know and share with your spouse how you best like to be loved. But that comes when the privilege to know and be known has been learned and earned. With Genevieve, from the very first point of her falling apart in the airport, why did she have to react with a blur of tears to her husband's admitting his infidelity? Especially if it wasn't the first time. She'd been telling everyone she was fine for so long. Is her sense of self so tied to him that she becomes emotionally unregulated every time he admits his mistakes, as if it's in direct correlation to her worth? Does she not have boundaries enough in how she handles him or herself in this situation? And on a deeper, more mature level, she could have compassion for him that he went against his value system, against their marital agreements, to see that he was suffering. And yes, I have seen women get to that point of compassion. Not that she brushes it off by any means, but that she sees that he is struggling, and she is really a strong enough person to know it's not really about her. And if it were true that Genevieve should lose the weight and stop hoarding in order to be loved, then there would be no overweight hoarders happily married. Both the victims and perpetrators in a breached marriage likely haven't learned how to soothe themselves well, how to self-regulate, how to co-regulate together, which we'll talk more about in the next part. Marriages today have the greatest potential for happiness in any time in history. Eli Finkel, psychology professor at Northwestern University, says, Americans today have elevated their expectations of marriage and can, in fact, achieve an unprecedentedly high level of marital quality if they invest a lot of effort. And as I say, having a profoundly good marriage means, like a good novel, fusing the upsetting and exhilarating into something magical. If marriage does end in a literal and legal divorce, take confidence in knowing that as you work on your part in marriage, you'll be divorced as the best version of you, even if it's not their best version of you, and you'll maintain your dignity and good spirit. You'll be the most loving, forgiving, real you who, if anyone divorces, it's because of their own issues. Yes? 3 soothers for smoothing the way in conflict. Soother number 1. For so long, I've heard this as the number 1 top marriage advice. Put the needs of your spouse above your own. The problem with this is answered in the Bible. Jesus Christ says, love your neighbor as yourself. Not putting that neighbor or spouse above yourself, but loving them as you love yourself. I also had conflict with needs. My needs may be chocolate. Just saying. So either he needs to get me chocolate or I need to redefine needs. So I love this quote by Jennifer Finlayson Fife, sex therapist. The goal in marriage is not to put the other's needs first, but to work with the inherent differences and create room for both partners to thrive. We can all have a piece of the pie. We can love our own way, how we love best, and everyone thrives. So much conflict arises from a spouse complaining their companion won't love them how they want. I tell him I need to hear he loves me, and when he says it, it doesn't sound like he really means it. Well, you forced him to say it. He's just trying to show love your way. Or, I feel love when we touch, but her touch doesn't feel loving. But hey, she's trying to do it right. When things get heated in the system, the problem may be the system. We have the wrong system for change. Change the system, and we change the marriage. When you open the closet door and 50 shoes are piled on the floor, or 20 scarves are shoved in the corner, or unlabeled boxes topple over one another, things can be done better. In a marriage, if conversations escalate over the dinner table, if you really just don't work well cleaning the garage together, things can be done better. Creating room for both partners may mean recreating the system. If the system is to go straight to conflict, what system could replace that? Practice silence, a response gap before you proceed, or don't even continue the conversation if you're not on the level to do it. Get a mediator, a therapist, someone you both trust. We'll talk more about that in the next section. Change the time, place, situation you discuss or deal with things. Have an in-house or out-of-house separation to separate what's yours or not. Make a rule, like no talking about blank during dinner. You clean this part of the garage, and next week I'll get to this wall of shelving. What system is not working for you on a physical, emotional, spiritual, mental, and/or social level? I tweaked our communication system and finally put up this boundary. I stopped talking at 10:30 p.m. It only gets worse after that. Your system may be to go to those with bad marriages or who are happy to put your spouse down for advice. But why not go to a couple who seems to have it right? Get good advice. So remember to recreate the system. Another soother is self-care. Before we can work to resolve conflict, we must have foundational skills in place. There are 5 parts of self-care that I'll talk about here. A, rejuvenation. What do you really like in order to rejuvenate? What really fills you? B, boundaries. What will it take for you to push what will need to happen for your self-care? Without boundaries, it's hard to make room for yourself. To me, using resentment to your advantage is a part of self-care. I actually love resentment. It's my biggest indicator something is off. I have a real or imagined unfair treatment. Boundaries are being crossed. Fear of something taken advantage of me is bothering me. I am neglecting self-care. And generally, I would say resentment comes from an inner voice that bypasses reason that might otherwise tell me to push it down, or excuse it, or justify it, until I am in conflict. And resentment lets me know radical change is about to happen, because I can't ignore it anymore. Resentment is my whistleblower for change. For example, when I feel I'm doing the lion's share of the housework, the moment I get that telltale feeling of resentment, a tightening in my chest, and an irritation in my forehead, I call in the troops. Unload the dishwasher. Fold these towels. Take a turn at night with the baby. All of these I used to serve my family out of love, but false love gave way to resentment, and I recognize we need to have a little managed chat before it explodes into something ugly. C. Detaching as needed. Sometimes getting the care we need, especially in finding ourselves after overgiving, is to have a detaching time or place. Maybe going out of town on a solo trip, or sleeping in separate beds for a while. D. Safety. Knowing you can relax and be open to what you really need. This is an integral part of self-care, is safety, or being willing to, and feeling like you can be open and undefensive. E. Being true to yourself, which is born of the first 4 soothers. With these 5 parts of self-care in place, conflicts show up in a much different way, if at all. An integral part of self-care is being true to yourself. And if you've been avoiding the truth about yourself and others for very long, you lose the grip on who you really are. And then you become enmeshed, taking on your spouse's stuff, and the world's for that matter. And the responsibility for each other's happiness lies with each other. Remember the Jennifer von Lacem Fife quote, "Work with the inherent differences and create room for both partners to thrive." If you really know who you are, you don't become so entwined in others until you lose yourself and only care about what they care about, and then you are really in conflict with yourself. Gaining a sense of self helps you both. Recognize where you may be empathic in your interactions, where you unwittingly and probably unknowingly take on others' energy. Much more on this in Love Zone Marriage 2 course, Converting Self. Problem solving occurs at the level of triggering events. It's hard not to try to problem solve, but it should happen before the triggering event. Soother number 3 is seeing your part in the marriage conflict. I once sat in a marriage course next to a lady who was alone like me. When the presenter asked us to practice a communication method with the person next to us, she explained, "I don't even know why I came to this marriage class alone. I believe these classes are no good unless your spouse takes it with you." But I would say probably the biggest force for change in conflict in my marriage has been born of what I have done alone, all by myself. And my husband's making his own individual changes in the way and methods that work for him, which, as we have found, are not the same for each other. When you recognize your part in a failing marriage, you discover a concept in the book, The Breakthrough Experience by John DeMartini. He encourages you to ask yourself, how am I doing what they are doing that bothers me? Why is it triggered in me, as opposed to others who aren't triggered by the same thing? So here are some examples of this in my marriage. When I loathe his expectations of me, I have expectations of him to not have expectations of me. When I think he's being rude, somewhere I am being rude. If I think he is spending money foolishly, somewhere I believe I am also spending money foolishly. It's really my problem, because if money were not an issue, the issue wouldn't be an issue. If I don't like how he is always wanting sex, where else am I always wanting something I feel I don't get enough of? The challenging event. Where in our past does that bring something up? For example, when people talk politics, I do not get riled up, like some people do. Why? It's not a challenging event to me. I don't care enough about it. I don't have enough care or experience to be wrong or right about it, so I'm happy, truly happy being neutral. But start talking about how to be a good parent, and I'll have my opinions, and my thoughts will be stimulated about my feelings on parenting. The key to accepting the challenging event in our relationships is, first, recognizing it in ourselves, which alone is quite difficult. Second, seeing how it affects us. What emotions does it bring up? Third, finding the origin of the challenging event. Did it bother me somewhere growing up? What inner child experience or thought does this keep me stuck in? Fourth, seeing the issue as a good thing, something that serves us whether we like it now or not. See where the thing that bothers you is in yourself. Eli Finkel says, how we resolve conflict is the most important indicator of marriage repair. So his great love hack is the following. Often we are so stuck in our own argument and not seeing our failing part in the issue that we can't have a reasonable perspective. So to change your perspective, write what is happening in conflict in the third person, devoid of emotion. You may be frustrated that your husband is late for dinner. When he arrives, he explains he was helping an elderly neighbor carrying her packages, so he's right on time for dinner. But the third person perspective is that husband is 10 minutes beyond the time wife had dinner ready, and an old lady had help she didn't expect. Their food is still warm. They can just drop it and not let it become a source of contention. So ask yourself these soother questions. How am I putting my spouse above me? How can we instead celebrate and work with our differences? Am I taking care of myself to have something to give? Am I being true to me? Am I being honest with my spouse and others? How do I see the triggering thing, the challenging event in myself? Conflict resolution. Fighting makes a good marriage. I tried to think of a good conflict example in my recent marriage to highlight in this section. I had to think for a long while until I remembered one that happened a couple months back. And this is a far cry to the constant conflict I once felt in marriage. In fact, my therapists have told me I had chronic anxiety and even PTSD from how I let problems in my marriage affect the old, undifferentiated me. So I feel qualified to share what we have done so that you too have to rack your brain until you can remember your last conflict session. So our latest conflict went as follows. Some family and I decided to take a 5,000-mile summer trip across the United States, and I asked my husband to make sure the car was ready. I told him we had a lot of baggage and to keep car care necessities minimal. 500 miles into our trip, in a desolate part of Wyoming, we found our car smelling like burning oil, and engine oil on the dipstick non-existent. Even I, not a car person, knew this was bad. One of my handier family members offered to get under the car and check the oil filter, if I would just hand him a 10mm something or other. I searched through the car and didn't run upon a single tool. I sheepishly informed him there was no tool to be found. Kind strangers around us offered their tools, and we indeed found that we were in a dire situation. We had to find a towing company still open. We had to get family shuttled to the next city 40 miles away, wait overnight and a half a day to get an oil leak fixed, and finally we were back on the road. When my husband and I later discussed this unfortunate breakdown, I mentioned, I was pretty embarrassed we didn't have a single tool in the car. He replied, well, you can't blame it on me. Stop right there. The old me might have said, we all make mistakes, it was probably my fault, in the end it was all right, and so forth. Instead, I held true to what I really felt and communicated it unequivocally. Actually, I assume you would be the one responsible between the two of us to get tools in the car. I mean, really, even though I said to prepare us minimally, you send us 5,000 miles without a single tool in the car? Said with folded arms. I acted more assertively than I have in the past. How I really felt. Not maliciously, but in a straightforward, truthful way, instead of sweeping it under the rug to avoid conflict. Now I have to admit here how much my husband has grown since the old days where this might have bloomed into a week-long war. He didn't say a thing, and next thing I knew, a small toolbox graced the back of said car. We've been learning thus far that when you are strong in who you are, you have less conflict outside you because conflict within is less. We've talked about how conflict can create something wonderful in time. We've gone over a few systems and methods and models in previous Love Zone Marriage courses for resolving conflict, from communication in Love Zone Marriage 5 course, emotions in Love Zone Marriage 4, to the language of forgiveness we use in Love Zone Marriage 8. So though I'd like to say we're all becoming masters of our self-regulation, self-care, self-concept, and so forth, it's good to have tools along the way to go from birds that may peck at each other incessantly to a place where you have to think back a few months to recall a conflict. So now that we've had all this fluffy, feel-good info, we're going to talk about fighting. John Gottman says the way a couple handles conflict, including fighting, is the #1 indicator of whether the couple will make it. And a reminder that conflict and contention are not the same things. Conflict is a normal part of existence, and contention has a dark, discordant side to it. So when I say fight, it's in the sense of a determined working for something better. There are 5 R's to repairing conflict, or good fighting. This is from theargumenthangover.com. The first R is relationship. Be aware of the effect the conflict has had or is having on the relationship, noticing the damage done. 2. Respect, which covers safety and uses perspective. 3. Responsibility. How have each had a hand in the matter, as you've heard me talk about over and over? And yeah, even when one spouse has breached a marriage in a large way, there's at least a small place the other spouse can take accountability, like being enmeshed or withholding connection. A myriad of small ways because nobody's perfect. The fourth R is repair. Not revenge or punishment, but effort spent in a positive direction. And lastly, reintegration. Collaboration, not coercion or isolation, with the end goal to create trust, space, and healthy connection. Do you remember John Gottman's 4 horsemen from Love Zone Marriage 5? The horseman is a conflict response style, and then we have its antidote. The first of the 4 horsemen is criticism, verbally attacking personality or character. And the antidote is a gentle startup. Use I statements, expressing feelings, plus a positive need. The second horseman is contempt, attacking the other's sense of self to insult. And the antidote? Appreciate. Note their positive qualities and find gratitude. The third horseman is defensiveness. Victimize yourself to avoid a perceived attack. And the antidote is taking responsibility. Accept their perspective, and if needed, offer an apology. And the last horseman, stonewalling, withdrawing to avoid conflict and disagreement. And the antidote is self-soothing, taking a break, doing something soothing. The experts tag 5 different conflict styles: avoiding, competing, compromising, accommodating, collaborating. As you see on this chart, each has various levels of assertiveness and cooperation. So let's talk about conflict resolution styles in the following example. Let's say spouse A really wants to move. They found the perfect job an hour away, but spouse B loves their house and friends close by. So, avoiding. Spouse B avoids the conversation whenever possible. Nothing gets resolved. Remember, avoiding conflict is the #1 reason for divorce. Essentially, you learn to not care by moving away from the conflict, which translates to not caring about your spouse. The next style, competing. Spouse A and B demand why their way is better, and they cycle round and round, getting more heated each time they speak of it. The house they love and the job they want become sticky points, starting a whole new round of bantering time and time again. Competing is what we generally think of with fighting in marriage, in a way that doesn't work. The next style, accommodating. Spouse B gives in and agrees to move from the house and friends they love. Or spouse A gives up the perfect job and they stay. On to compromise. Compromising is dividing something, taking turns, giving up something, minimizing time in the deciding process to come to a good enough solution for now. So, compromise is they find a house midway between both cities. Or they decide to move to the city of the new job and agree they'll move back to the old city in 5 years. Or they stay and spouse B promises spouse A they can get another job in 5 years wherever they want to move. As a side note, I recommend agreeing to never agree to disagree. It seems disagreeable, like let's agree to stay in conflict. Agreeing to disagree, which is a compromise, shows close-mindedness, selfishness, and pride. It creates a separation, a missed opportunity for empathy and perspectives. You can instead disagree agreeably, as in, that's fascinating you feel that way. I'm glad that's working for you. In something that truly must be handled or resolved, that's where you go to compromise if necessary, and collaboration if possible. So, collaboration. Spouse A looks into it and finds they can telework. Bam! Or spouse A finds out another employee of the prospective job commutes in his self-driving Tesla, and they catch up on the news or play chess together during the drive. Or spouse A and B find a more awesome house in the new city, and spouse B sets up a monthly lunch with besties back in the old city and looks forward to new friends in the new city. The goal of collaboration is to add something valuable from each person. Collaboration happens when something bigger than each person combines to result in something greater than before. Collaboration is creation at its best. Much of conflict resolution has to do with communication, but as I repeat over and over, you may communicate all day long and still stay stuck. What really needs to happen is a changed heart. Consider the things we talk about in this section to be resources that may serve as stepping stones to where you really want to be with that changed heart. So I'll introduce a small conflict pattern that will get things going, then we'll move to a more complicated pattern. This is the 3-part conflict model. 1. I feel, fill in the blank, with an emotion or a feeling. 2. When you, fill in the blank, describing behavior. 3. Because, fill in the blank, this is the impact on you. I feel sad when you raise your voice, because I feel like I will never be good enough for you. Note, this could have been, I am mad at you because you yell at me, and so no dinner for you. Another example, I feel hurt when you scoff at my ideas, because it makes me feel stupid. This could have been, I don't like how you make me feel dumb, so I won't talk to you until you tell me something nice. Or worse, just seethe, which is avoiding. Here is the next model I'd like to introduce, which is the share-respond conflict model, which I am proud to say I was able to condense from 15 different conflict models. So the first acronym, SHARE. S, share a specific situation. Don't get lost in the drama of all or nothing thinking. H is honor soft emotions of hurt, loss, or failure. Recognize origins from the past here. A, assume your interpretation of your story. R, request your need, not as a demand or expectation. And E, evaluate, assess how it's going. Turn it over to the other person for a reply if you feel open to it, but let them express their side at some point. And then the acronym RESPOND. R, repeat what you heard. E, empathize to show understanding. S, seek common ground. P, paraphrase how they felt. O, open your mind, be curious, not condemning. N, notice expressed needs. And D, determine the next steps. And the next steps might involve solving the problem or even just sympathizing. A lot of conflict can be avoided if you just say, did you just want to tell me this, or did you want to find a solution? And they might just say, oh, I just wanted to express that. And that's all they needed. Let's do an example with the share-respond conflict model about a son who likes to game. We start with S, share a specific situation. So the wife says, the other day, do you remember when you told our son, you are lazy and you game too much? He repeats what he heard. You are saying I told our son he is lazy and games too much? Back to her. H, honor soft emotions, hurt, loss, and failure. She says, I feel hurt when it seems you are attacking a son I try to build up and encourage. They are already put down so much at school. E, he empathizes to show his understanding. You feel hurt when you think I'm attacking our son. And then S, seek common ground. Yeah, it's hard to know the balance in parenting. Back to her, assume your interpretation of the story. I know these are my thoughts, but I feel my job as a mom is undermined. Back to him, paraphrase how they felt. You felt undermined as a mom. Open your mind to be curious, not condemning. Can you tell me more about why you feel undermined? Back to her. R of request your need, not as a demand or expectation. She asks, would you be careful what you say to him and how it affects him? And then the N, back to him, notice expressed needs. You would like me to be careful with what I say? And then back to E, of her evaluate, assess how it's going, turn it over to the other for reply. She says, Tell me your thoughts, if she feels like going here at this time. And then back to him, D. Determine next steps. Solve or empathize. He says, do you want to discuss this more, or just let me know how you've been feeling? Take note, just because she is saying what she feels about how her husband treats their son doesn't mean it's truth, a fact, and his responsibility to follow through on something different. So let's reverse it. Share. Share a specific situation. So he says, the other day when I said our son games too much, I have my reasons for thinking he does. She repeats, you are saying you have your reasons for thinking he plays too much? Back to him. Honor soft emotions of hurt, loss, failure. He says, I feel sad when I think about how much time I wasted as a teen, and I don't want to see him follow my same steps. Back to her. Empathize to show understanding. You feel sad when you see him wasting time like you did at his age. And then she seeks common ground. Yeah, we both have different ways of parenting here. Back to him. Assume your own interpretation of your story. I see that you don't like him put down, but what if it's my job as a dad to set him straight here? Back to her. Paraphrase. You feel it's your job as a parent to set him straight? And then she's open to be curious and not condemning. Can you tell me about how you think the words you say are helping him? She is just curious. She's not attacking. And then back to him. Request your need. He says, would you let me parent him how I feel I should as a dad? And then she says, as she notices his needs, you would like me to let you parent our son your way? They have not escalated to a fight. They are still keeping it calm. Back to him with the evaluate. Do you have a suggestion for handling this differently? If he feels like going here. And then back to D with her. Determine the next steps. I have some ideas if you want to discuss this more. Or, she says, I'm glad to hear your thoughts. Thanks. It's important to be aware of inner child needs. In this example, Dad felt guilty for wasting time. But does that mean it's right his son shouldn't waste time? And did Mom have experiences of her own being verbally attacked or of being put down a lot at school? That doesn't mean they need to translate it to their son, who may be doing just fine in his development. Or maybe not, but maybe that's his journey. So ask yourself these questions about your inner child needs. What needs am I expecting my spouse to feel from childhood or another impacting time? What do I wish my spouse did better for me, whether or not they should? Where did I lack emotionally most growing up? Where was I over-emotional, indicating the true hurt? And what does my spouse do to push my buttons most? And can I see how it's related to something from my past and it's not their responsibility? Take note where conflict arises because we haven't addressed or processed experiences or thought patterns from our past, and be careful about assigning the cure to your spouse. Though when you know and are known well by your spouse, which we'll talk about in the next section, they can be a great helpmeet here. And another side note, one big source of conflict in marriage is sexual intimacy, like higher desire versus lower desire situations. Look for more on this in the next course, Love Zone Marriage 11. So, what are some tips for fighting well? In taking care of yourself, keep things on your side, his things on his side. Be true to you, as we've talked about. Cooperate first, compromise if necessary, collaborate when possible. Conflict resolve when not already heated or even uncaring, like in a weekly couples council. When people speak, they are always talking about themselves. Always. Ponder for a minute on how when you speak of yourself. Remember not to bury emotions, but don't let hard emotions like hate and anger dominate, and don't take it out on a spouse. See your part in what you do. Understand your triggers. Notice defensiveness and offensiveness. Stop trying to take control. Realize conflict happens out of scarcity. As you are the listener, seek clarification. Relate it back to you so the other doesn't feel interrogated, questioned without building trust in an empathetic response. Notice body language. Physically connect. Hug before hard conversations. Return to a pause place as needed, if things get heated. When your looping cycle happens, the conversation that happens over and over again, reconvene as necessary. If you call a time out, call a time back in. Ignore the high alert of the brain, which avoids pain, seeks pleasure, and takes less effort. But you may need to quiet the brain here in order to find solutions. Stop resisting, start allowing. Don't label, as it leads to shame and shaming. Be willing to be uncomfortable and to see your part. See how you are difficult to live with because you are hurting. See your spouse as hurting, not as attacking or retreating. Realize some things just take time, sometimes a lot of time, and that's the journey. Have a good spirit with you. Seek safety and trust through empathy, curiosity, kindness, understanding, attentiveness, maturity, perspective, being mindfully present with respect and dignity for both, loving spouse as yourself. This is the love zone balance after all. And my most important advice, let God handle your spouse if things seem unresolvable. Allow their own healing. Think of that proverb. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not unto your own understanding. Acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path. As an assignment from this part, I'd like to invite you to try the following. Try the 3-part conflict model. I feel, fill in the blank of the emotion or the feeling, when you describe the behavior, and 3, because, fill in the blank of the impact on you. Then do the share-response conflict model. Here we have share, a specific situation, honor, soft emotions of hurt, loss, failure. A is assume your interpretation of your story. R, request your need, not as a demand or an expectation. E, evaluate, assess how it's going, turn it over to your spouse for the reply. And then respond. R, repeat what you heard. E, empathize to show understanding. S, seek common ground. P, paraphrase how they felt. O, open your mind. Be curious, not condemning. N, notice expressed needs. D, determine next steps. Do you need to solve or sympathize? I hope that you can find that changed heart as you learn to fight well, fighting for a marriage worth keeping. In this section, we will go from sink, S-I-N-K, to sync, S-Y-N-C. S. Selecting your opposition makes all the difference in marriage. The hardest year of marriage is this year. Put aside the first year of marriage being the hardest, or the year you were jobless, or the year you had a colicky baby, or the year your teen overran your every rule. Marriage is a work in progress, and like I love to say about books, my favorite book is the one I'm reading right now. Life happens right now, and marriage strengthening happens in the present. Things worth having are worth working and waiting for. But I ran upon a concept that absolutely changed my life, including, of course, my marriage. And this is the concept. There must be an opposition in all things. But does opposition mean struggle and trial? Must there be struggle and trial in all things? Think of opposites, light and dark, heavy and light, big and small, loud and quiet. You can think of situations where both of these differing extremes are good and not so good. This is opposition, both sides of a spectrum. I believe we each fall into roughly 3 opposition types. The first is the defeatist, who is a fatalist, a reactor. What they do is planned, but it's against them. Like the drama of someone going to the hospital or a good friend fight. Their opposition is strangely planned, though not in their favor, but for the extraneous benefit it will bring them. The next type, as you'll see on this chart, is accepted opposition. The realist, the actor, one who follows the script. They believe they shouldn't dream too big, or they'll be let down. A maintainer, a manager, most of us. And I believe the ideal is what I call the championist. One who plans opposites in their favor. A creator who crafts proactive ways of generating extremes. They say, I can have my cake and eat it too. Consider these beneficial opposites. Yin and yang. Entropy and organization. A falling apart and a pulling back together again. Virtue and vice. Both lead to growth. meditation and adventure, connection and space, sacrifice and love, which some define love as the balance between sorrow and joy, two opposites. And the fun happens when you apply choosing your opposition in marriage, not reacting or simply acting, but crafting, planning opposition to work for you, because we need the opposites and the polarity of those extremes. So here are some choices with opposition in marriage. You can hold couples counsel weekly when things are going fairly well, or you can pay for therapy weekly when things are worse. You can choose to be healthy for each other through exercise and good eating habits, or be unproductive and accept sickness and needing to caretake one another. You can assume the bad about each other, blaming and attacking, or choose the better thoughts, being curious and assertive. You can choose each other by implementing date night, or you can choose to ignore or neglect one another and see those accompanying results. You can choose to communicate on the defensive or offensive, or you can choose to stop controlling and instead accept each other with compassion. You can fight over parenting styles or choose to let each parent in the way that they will, trusting that each of you is the perfect parent, even in your imperfections, for your child. You can be grumpy, or you can give yourself good self-care so you can't help but let your goodness shine onto your spouse. A Chinese proverb says, "The scent of a rose will always linger on the hand of the giver." You can withhold serving your leeching spouse, or you can choose to serve wholeheartedly in a way that works for you both, having boundaries while you do so. You can select the opposition of bitterness or the opposition of sweet. Truly your choice. When something we consider as bad happens, we can react, we can act, or we can create. We can be a fatalist, a realist, or the championist. We can learn something about life, ourselves, or marriage, a lesson like patience, forgiveness, and what our choice of reacting or acting or creating says about us, and how to shift and adjust things for the better opposite. And if you find it hard to land on the championist mindset opposition, why would that be? I'm not saying to be all positive. That's unrealistic, as we need a spectrum of emotions for full living. Without opposition, we can't even know what is good, but we can expect mostly good. So what do I do to select my opposition in marriage? Well, it's a mindset. If something seems like it's happening wrong, where haven't I honored the opposite? Is there a more effective opposition? If I'm bored in marriage, where have we not implemented constructive opposites? If it feels everything is terrible, where can I become a creator and push things into the favorable? Even a little laughter, a lightening up. If I feel needy, can I stop chasing? If I feel the need to fly, can I be content with stillness? And if I'm sad, what have I been lacking in my self-care so I can meet up in a sweeter way with my sweetie pie? And what would be your opposites in your marriage? A good hike instead of a fight? A massage instead of a mean message? Connecting with those outside you who build you up when you can't find it in marriage in the moment? I encourage you today to find the opposition that works for you as a proactive creator in your marriage. I interrupt ants. The premise of this section is don't get stuck in a loop, a thinking loop that stays negative. Some call automatic negative thinking, ANT, ants. Ants that crawl all over you and you want to brush them away. Have you ever been stuck in a boat? Maybe you've bottomed out, are caught in the reeds, or are rowing against the wind, or someone even came and tipped you over. Our thoughts in marriage can become stuck, like this in conflict, and eventually contention. Our thoughts in this regard become a habit. You may have heard of it as a neural superhighway. Thoughts are so used to the ruts of the route that it's difficult to jump out of it to a new route. This is especially true of a brain in trauma. It's just trying to keep us alive, and it will stay in this rut even when danger has passed because it thinks it's still serving us. We may have stuck ants in marriage of, if I don't do this, enabling, he'll leave me. A good wife should, fill in the blank, even if it's what you don't want to be doing. These, fill in the blank, are his continual flaws. He's so selfish, and on and on. Think for a moment of what circles around in your head about your spouse that repeats over and over, maybe even barely consciously. The thoughts become like a justifying friend, always on your side and willing to bully up against him. You hardly even recognize them anymore because they're just always there. To create a new healthy superhighway, we need to create interrupts to the ants. We can do this by 3 things I'll suggest here. The first is awareness. Just even write down the top 3 thoughts that swim around. I would say it's even a good idea to notice if you are a rumination personality. Love Zone Marriage 6 course talks more about types who might hold a grudge like an owl holds a pellet in their throat. Then ask yourself, do I really want to be this way? Why am I letting my spouse affect me this way? Is this really me, the true me? Are these thoughts useful? How do I want to show up in this marriage? You may just be comfortable with these sinking thoughts and need the interrupt of asking what your higher self really wants. At this point, it's a great idea to forgive your spouse and yourself for these old patterns and turn over a new leaf, deciding on a new helpful pattern of thinking, which won't happen automatically, but I can guarantee with practice, you'll be wondering how you could have ever thought anything bad about your spouse. Side note, meditation has been super healing for me to slow down the thoughts, to calm my mind to a theta brainwave suggestible state that has me rewriting how I think of me and others. A game changer. 10 minutes a day is a decent start, but it takes about 20 minutes for most people to get the tangled web of thoughts to quiet enough to be productive in implanting new thoughts. I believe 30 minutes is ideal, and if you think that you can't spare that time, do you really like the conflicting thoughts you entertain now? Interrupting ants becomes more natural when you get that brain cranking in a new gear. Admittedly, some of these thoughts may be so ingrained and so definite we think they're absolute truth, which is why therapy can be so helpful. To get out of our stuck thoughts, someone else outside us can help us challenge. We'll talk about therapy next. N. Neglect not good therapy. I fought therapy for several years. If God wanted me to change, He would be the instrument of change in my mind. But it wasn't until I had my son in therapy and I was an emotional wreck all over the place in that therapy room that I realized I needed some help. I speak all about emotional regulation in Love Zone Marriage 4 course, but suffice it to say, I eventually found myself finding myself again because of the wise prodding of people outside my own head. I came to see that God provides those in our path as answers to prayers, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I've probably seen about 20 therapists that have each lended me integral help in their individual ways. So I have some tips here. You may think therapists are a crock, and some of them are. Like some therapists tell you to just have more sex. That's the ticket. Until it isn't, because foundational pieces aren't in place. It's like a Band-Aid. Not every therapist is a good therapist or right for you. That's why you shop around for a fit. You may think you must have your spouse there for therapy to be effective, or the other spouse absolutely doesn't want to go and it dissuades you from going. But a large percentage of my therapy has been for me alone, and when I came together with my spouse, I couldn't help but be a better companion. And though you can't change your spouse, they will have to react and adapt and respond to the changed you. You may learn in completely different ways, in the same book, but not on the same page. So it's good to reach out separately. I have to laugh though, because one of the sessions that my spouse and I did hold together, the therapist later confided in my spouse that I was their most hostile client. Nice that you can't help me hold my pain, which is why I was paying you the big bucks. And actually a win for me, as I've been a people pleaser until recently, that the therapist actually recognized some burgeoning assertion in me I'm now proud of. And my spouse dropped that therapist that spoke badly of his sweetie pie. Some people are stuck in therapy for years and years. It's like the therapist becomes their crutch, their cushion, someone to complain to, but never make changes. So we get a bad taste thinking once we cave to therapy, it'll never end. Ultimately, though, you might find, like me, it's always good to have a trusted person outside marriage to set you straight as needed, that outside perspective. Why therapy will help. You get that outside perspective for your looping thoughts, as we spoke about in the last section. It helps you recognize emotional abuse as just as damaging as physical abuse, and brain scans prove it. If you have unrealistic or demanding expectations of your spouse and continually badger them about it, putting them down and gaslighting, denying what really happened, it's like a physical beating. It broadens your thinking about gender roles. We may get caught in thinking certain genders should do this or that in marriage, and therapy can help us see where we are misinformed or judging ourselves in unhelpful ways of who does what in marriage. One may be the wave and one may be the cave, gender aside. It helps to get out the junk without spewing it on your spouse. Some say you should have no secrets, but when you have a sounding board in a therapist to get your stuff out, that isn't talking about your spouse's behind your spouse's back, telling secrets. That's smart. To get it all out to someone who is not affected. I was appalled to find out some therapists do lie detector tests to make sure everyone is being truthful. Oh, so let's force someone's agency. Enmeshed and undifferentiated people need to know everything about each other. Plus, I believe that in a need to redefine your relationship, you may very well need your own secrets to reestablish what is and what is not yours. Maybe even to keep your new baby dreams and hopes protected. When I have felt anxious about therapy, I use this idea. I think about my angels and the therapist's angels and my spouse's angels conferencing together divinely in my behalf. So no matter what happens in a therapy session, the angels have got my back. If you haven't worked with a therapist but think it could help you in marriage, I encourage you to schedule a consultation, which many therapists will do to see if you are a fit. And some insurances will pay for it. Most, I have found, won't pay for marriage therapy, but they will pay for anxiety, depression, trauma therapy, which are categories that all ultimately help in marriage. And if you do end up paying for therapy, would it be worth it to pay for happiness with your spouse, for not having to pay for divorce, for foregoing a future vacation to pay for therapy so you can have awesome vacations going forward? I think so. K. Know your adversary. God is good, the devil is evil, especially in marriage. If you believe in God, there's probably a good chance you believe in Satan too. And if marriage is ordained of God, that it's not good for man and woman to be alone, then Satan is very against the goodness of marriage. So it just has to be said. The adversary would love to tear you apart. The adversary tries to disconnect us from others and loosen our sense of self and lose our sense of others so we can be miserable like him. When you fight to the point of contention, the devil cheers. When you tear your family apart, Satan celebrates. You've heard, the devil made me do it. Blame it all on the devil. And a new favorite, not today, Satan. So can you see how important it is to realize the forces used against you in a marital union ordained by God? And of course, Satan wants to remain in the dark, hidden and slippery. So you may even blame your spouse when Satan's minions prod you. What if you could instead step back and see, when you are agitated, it may not be you. When you fear or hate, it may not be yours. When you are blaming, shaming, and embarrassed, the minions may be working overtime. If you stop and really think about it, can you imagine the rancorous thoughts the dark forces might whisper to us about marriage? Just face it, you've grown apart. There's no more love. He's your problem for everything. They'll never be able to bring you happiness. Why stick it out? Hit 'em where it hurts. And we take it as our own thoughts and run with it. And we stop being our true selves, prompted and influenced by unseen forces having a heyday with your tightest union on earth. Demons laugh when they see how you canker and scourge one another, having no idea of the malicious source, hell-bent on bringing each other down, while the adversary slowly counts down from 10. Know this: what holds your attention holds you. And if you're looking for the bad, it will find you. and join you in your assault. What you don't solve, you take forward. Satan plants thoughts like weeds. Then your brain nourishes and fertilizes and builds the thought weeds. Will you pluck the bad thought up or let it invade the rest of the good plants, going to seed and infiltrating the goodness of the other crops? We can go instead from fixing what is wrong to growing what is strong. Fortunately, I have got a few awesome tips for overwhelming the adversary in marriage. Tip 1. Keep a black journal and a colored journal. The black journal records what you determine could easily be voices of the dark forces. You will never be good enough. Stop trying. It's easier to not stay married. In the colored journal, write 2 counter statements of truth about you. I am totally good enough in this marriage. I will lean more on God and look for the good in my spouse with a grateful heart. I did this practice for about a year and got pretty good at identifying adversarial attacks and championing the truth within myself. Satan is great at tempting a spouse to over-emotionalize or distort marital issues. So the solution? Tip 2. Talk about issues within 24 hours with your spouse and don't hold a grudge. Remember, don't be an avoider. And another powerful practice. Tip 3. Have 5 scriptures memorized and at the ready when you feel an onslaught. Here are some of mine. If God is for us, who can be against us? Romans 8:31. For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. 2 Timothy 1:7. Be strong and of a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed. For the Lord thy God is with thee whithersoever thou goest. Joshua 1:9. Fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them. 2 Kings 6:16. And I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. Philippians 4:13. So, could it be Satan? Likely so. S. Sweet spot of knowing. There was a time a few years back where I looked at this once wonderful display of roses you see here that I had cut from my rose garden and sighed as I declared, just like marriage, wilty heads drooping, no life force left. It's amazing how much an improved marriage can vitalize your very energy stores. So much energy gets drawn from regularly withholding, living as your true self in your marital interactions, your natural expression in order to be right, or not be taken advantage of, or to not be caught unawares. What you really think or feel, keeping precious parts of you left best unshared. A feeling of freedom that relational trauma can squash. Love, a natural condition of freely giving and taking love. So when I adopted the idea of really knowing and being known, as I learned from sex therapist Jennifer Finlayson Fife, things began to really shift. So let me share a story to illustrate knowing and being known. One spring, my neighbor had some raspberry starts they offered to me to come dig up and transfer to our garden. I imagined how happy my husband would be to enjoy sweet, delicious raspberries straight from the garden. They were his favorite. I dug up about 30 plants from my neighbor and pushed them home 2 blocks in the wheelbarrow. I proudly wheeled them to the garden where my husband worked, preparing the soil. I smiled at him, relishing in my good work, as he then bluntly stated, "Looks like you did it all wrong. I should have come with you." I paused, knowing I had done just fine, and replied, "Oh, this is what you say to me. Thank you so much for your efforts and that you were doing it for me since you knew I liked raspberries so much. I'm sure they'll grow just fine." I was surprised when he just smiled and we continued our transplanting. Later that evening I mentioned, I actually like strawberries better than raspberries. To which he replied, "Me too." "What? You're always the one drooling over raspberries, but I don't see you drooling over strawberries." To which he replied, "That's because I get strawberries all the time. Raspberries are more rare." Go figure, after all these years of trying to please him through raspberries. There is a sweet spot between my spouse knowing me and my teaching him. And I would say this happens so much more effectively when not dealing with the boulder of conflict between us. When things are not right in the marriage, any number of innocent comments might throw in a sour response. So cleaning up the tendency for conflict, as we've discussed all these past sections, creates a safety for knowing and being known. So basically, the sweet spot, the no-teach sweet spot, is that he knows and I teach. Ultimately, my spouse should know me well enough to please me, and I teach my spouse to know my needs and preferences. He needs to take the time and effort to discover me like he might his favorite hobby or activity or sport, and the same from me to him. The knowing we might hear about in the Bible, which has several meanings. Wink, wink. If knowing doesn't happen on his part, I honor his agency, his choice to be him. If teaching doesn't happen on my part, I could give myself some self-validation, self-care, self-accountability, so that I am a better teacher, not an expector. However he responds, I love and accept him. I love my spouse exactly as he is, and I am okay with myself even when my spouse doesn't do what I want. This is unconditional loving. When he doesn't meet my needs, I myself meet my needs because I truly know myself best, and I honor him for his efforts to try to please me even when they don't. I accept him anyway. For example, I might say as the teacher, I need some space. He replies, and I need more connection. We know in our specific marriage this is true according to our personalities. These needs can be antithetical. They both require the opposites. When you apply the share-respond model from a few sections ago, instead of his rebutting with, and I need more connection, he may reply, tell me more about your needing some space. I say, I love you, but when I get this space I'm requesting, I can regroup, relax, reintegrate myself with fully living. When I learn about my spouse that he wants to feel cared for, there's a piece of my heart that goes out to him, and I want to help fulfill that need, and the same from him to me. When he realizes I can regroup, relax, and reintegrate myself with full living, he sees how that fully living includes him. He gets a piece of me when I get my need fulfilled. By learning about each other, we learn how to make needs of each work for the both of us. Collaboration! So what if they are unwilling to do the needs we say that we need? This is where we get creative with our options. We stop making our spouses the answer to everything. We find other people that helpfully help us fill a need. We make sure we have done what we can on our side. We can have grace and compassion that he won't remember and do everything perfectly, and I can love him 100% anyway. We enlist heavenly help for instruction on how to fulfill that need. And in the end, if you have been true and honest and open and it's still not happening, you can then decide if this is the relationship you really want to keep. At these times, you accept the incompatibility and move on. But when I have observed people following the steps I've outlined of taking care of yourself, of expressing your needs and desires, and loving anyway, a couple grows much closer together, not drifting farther apart. So my invitation to you here is to teach your spouse one thing you've been keeping a secret. Not long ago, I conceded to my husband that I'm just not a morning person, so don't expect a lot from me in the morning. I'd been grudgingly faking it most of our marriage. And learn something new about your spouse. Become curious. Do they like raspberries or strawberries better? Why your God wall? Let me introduce you to the God wall. The God wall is a shield and at the same time an allowance, a connector. It is unique in one quality we usually think of with walls. It's not solid. This wall is made of a semi-permeable membrane. Let me explain where the God wall stands. It stands equally between you and your husband. In a way, it separates each other from the effects of one another, like conflict. When I realized my enmeshment with my husband, and that his problems were my problems and mine were his, my first instinct was to create a dome of sorts, a clear barrier that kept me from the effects of codependent caring that didn't serve me well. Around my husband, it was as if his tall, looming shadow pressed itself upon my dome. I'd taunt, "Can't get me from in here. I'm nice and toasty and comfy just as I am." My support people would tell me, "Let him fight his own demons, and you take charge of your life again. His eternal salvation, which seems linked so intimately with mine, is not your concern." Sorry, buddy, you've got to sink or swim, and I'm enjoying the lemonade on the beach. But it felt like with this dome in place, he became more needy and demanding. And keep in mind, these were my interpretations. And I therefore became more isolated. And then I finally discovered this God wall. Remember the love zone balance, loving God first and your spouse as yourself, as you'll recall from this diagram? As you both draw closer to God and should grow closer to each other, according to geometry, but what if there is a disconnect anywhere in this triangle, say between your husband and God or between you and your husband? With the God wall between you two, there is protection and allowance of God, strength, power. You can stay on your side and let your husband refine himself through the God wall as he approaches you in a self-willingness to truly show up as God knows him. The most awesome place for you to both reside is within the semi-permeable wall, infused with God's trust, God's faith, God's mercy, God's grace. You can't help but be graced with his grace in this space. You both stand in the thickness of the God wall, imbued with both self-accountability, or justification, and divinity, sanctification, which happens within the possibilities of the God wall, connecting your higher self one to each other, to self and to God. It is a place of sacred balance, of being one with God and each other, enjoying agency to return to the delight of the God wall space with each other as you choose. What does this God wall mean in everyday living? It means you are a full person, complete as a self, but complementary with your spouse within the God wall. You work together greater as a whole because you have trust in God first. That when you both err, as we do as humans, God bridges that trust gap and you really are perfectly fine. It means when one of you lets the other down, you are still okay. So often, one spouse will lose faith in the other as they face the world with haughty defense, while they quietly crumble inside, a coping mechanism not working in their favor. But relational trauma does funny things when one-sided thinking backs you into a corner. With God between you, there's no corner to be backed into. It means that we don't wager happiness in marriage on the false hope you'll never mess up again. That weaknesses don't define us. Life provides the journey of overcoming those darker parts of us. It means we continue with faith in God as a rock-solid anchor to trust God enough to continue a satisfying marriage despite what either of you do or don't do. And if that ever changes, God will be the first to tell you. So it's not really about trusting each other. It's about trusting God. It means that I ask God what I can offer to my marriage, and I value that answer above my spouse's, loving God first. It means the best things are always worth finishing, like a crumbling old Victorian building being restored to something beautiful. That if something is meant to be wonderful, it will happen because it is the will of God. It means I trust in God even more when I feel I can share intimacy, a deep and inner knowing, with my husband. So what can this God wall mean to you? Now is your opportunity to recognize the God wall between you, to not allow conflict to stand as an impermeable wall between you, because when your priorities are straight, love infuses that wall between you. And it's hard to stay in chronic conflict, even contention, when love builds that wall. Notice and embrace that wall as the power that binds you together with God at the helm. N. No one like you two. Reba McEntire, country singer, talks of the three things we need in life: a wishbone, a backbone, and a funny bone. And in marriage, it means sharing your wishes, your dreams, pushing what's yours with drive, and lightening up with the funny bone for deliverance from the stale, the unhelpful, that which is in need of rebuilding. And remembering that sweet spot, the space where you and your spouse are safe together in a vulnerable space, where you know you can protect and understand each other. It's a place where you're able to share things that are deep with your spouse, if you choose. I remember when I came to this realization about humanity. Because of my perfectionism tendencies, in my mind I would say, that person made a mistake, and my underlying subconsciousness said, and hence, I hate them. Then I realized when people set me off, precipitating the hate. I was making a similar mistake somewhere, the breakthrough experience we spoke of, hating myself, really. And now I ask myself, how much more lovable is that person because they make mistakes? I can see their mistake and still love them 100%. And how much license does this give us to love ourselves as well, and to see our spouse for the good and their bad, and still love them 100%? Alain de Botton of Google, in his talk, Why You Will Marry the Wrong Person, says, love is to have the willingness to interpret someone's on the surface not very appealing behavior in order to find more benevolent reasons why it may be unfolding. That love includes tolerance for weakness and recognition of ambivalence. So here are some ideals about love. Learn to be more accepting of others and self as is. Eliminate unhealthy guilt, shame, blame, and embarrassment. Create opportunities to be known or seen. Find real love in healthy places elsewhere until you can find it in marriage. Realize loving is a gamble and a privilege, and worth it. Love perpetuates love, and love rejoices in the truth. Do you remember Jim and Genevieve from the first of this course? Genevieve wanted the love they used to have without her husband's wandering affections, and Jim wanted a slimmer, more loving wife. I'm happy to say that after much work and humbling, Jim and Genevieve found a centered and balanced marriage, one celebrating each other's true natures. Genevieve realized that though things weren't the same as they were when first married, they could be even better now. Most importantly, she realized that in her heart, she felt there was no one else like Jim. Though he had his issues, she could assume the best. She would operate from marriage being at its ideal. She could accept his strengths and weaknesses for the promise of the kind of love, the kind of charity, generosity of interpretation, a wonderful fusion of the good and the not so good in their marriage. And as for Jim, he came to a place where he could love all of his wife, no matter her size. He was the one needing love, only to realize there's no one else like Genevieve. After all, he reasoned, we negotiate imperfection of ourselves, our spouse, and all those around us every day. And loving can be tricky. Like all acts of integrity, loving involves liability. And what if you succeed? You might just get the wonderful marriage you thought you wanted. Happiness in marriage takes courage, flexibility, and faith. A coming together despite ourselves, in a way we can learn to sink. Not that we meld into each other with no end and no beginning, but that we honor the individuality of who we are, then the alliance, the harmony of being in tune with one another. Having understanding and connection beyond words, because there is no one like you two. I'd like you to try a little challenge. There's something powerful about the heart. Sure, it pumps and circulates all those approximately 2,000 gallons of blood each day. But think of this Bible scripture. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Matthew 6:21. Or this proverb, for as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. Or the scripture of which the Love Zone marriage classes I create is based on. In Matthew 22, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There's something energetic about the heart that transcends biology and physiology. The heart carries messages, holds meaning, and indicates value. I believe the condition of the heart parallels the condition of the morality of a person and their connection to humankind. Think, hard-hearted, black heart, heart of stone. And someone can be good-hearted, soft-hearted, kind-hearted. In general, we can sync hearts with those around us, those with a kindred heart or a passionate heart. So let's see where your heart syncs in marriage by doing this simple exercise. Simple, but you must have the compliance and a certain comfort level with your spouse. For the heart sync challenge, both of you stand so that your hearts meet together. Maybe stand on a stool. Maybe do a bear hug. Come to a calm centeredness as you tune into your spouse's heartbeat. Can you feel it? If not, it's fine to lower your ear to their heart. Now, what messages do you feel? Can you feel their value or what has meaning to them? Would you say you can sync with their heart? Take a minute or 2 or 10 to sync. Of course, take turns noticing. C. Coming into sync. There once was an encounter between a large naval ship and another sailing vessel, with which the large ship is on a collision course with the other vessel. The captain of the large naval ship can't see in the fog, but it knows it's going to collide with the other vessel. So the large naval ship messages the small vessel and says, "I am a large naval ship. You must get out of my way." The vessel responds, "I am the lighthouse. You must turn around." I think of this pompous naval ship as one member of a marriage who thinks they are right. They aren't at fault. They are more deserving of the goods. Have you ever felt that way? But remember, a marriage is a coming together, a combination or mixture of two elements, not one being more dominant and expansive, but they're both having equal importance, which often doesn't happen in a marriage. We find two floundering parts attempting to one-up or back down from, which makes them both less than when combined together. When we are off track but we think there's no turning around, we will crash into the land if we don't see what we must do to get back on course. As my husband so wittingly said, spouses can be a blessing to each other, like the icing on the cake, not the crumbs stuck to the bottom of the pan. And that's a quote. I hope this course has been eye-opening for you to see how living as your best version of you, of both of you in marriage, makes resolving conflict worth it and contention practically non-existent. So, here's a riddle for you. I can bring tears to your eyes, resurrect the dead, make you smile, and reverse time. I form in an instant, but I last a lifetime. What am I? When I asked this of my teen daughter, I loved her reply, Jesus Christ. And though that would be oh so correct, the answer I was fishing for was memory. Our fondest memories have an element of stress to them. The stress creates meaning. Conflict can be the stress that creates meaning to emphasize memory. What stresses have you found in your fondest marriage memories? Having a baby, moving, making them their favorite dinner, dealing with parenting issues, a vacation. Memory helps us sync. You don't quickly sync with a stranger because you have no reference points. Marriage is brimming with reference points. To be in sync, openness must be present. We bridge the gap of fear of vulnerability and fear of abandonment, which is a top fear of lovers. 2, a marital seduction, a charming and attracting because we are in sync. When you are in sync, you can feel it. Committed couples have a relation vibration, a melding of heart, spirit, body, soul, and mind. And when they're off, conflicts can morph quickly into contention. What did you notice from the heart sync challenge of the last section? Did you feel a connection? Or a wanting to have more connection? Do you think and feel that being in sync would decrease conflict and eliminate contention? What could you do to increase syncedness in your marriage? So, come into sync, and better yet, dream together. That is DREAM. Dream, share your individual and togetherness goals. That's D. R. Retreat together. Go on a fun reviving retreat, creating sync. E. Effective intimacy. Remember all-around intimacy as you create sync. A. Appreciation. You can't help but sync when feeling gratitude. And M of dream is mindful marriage. Give the attention syncing requires to make a marriage strong and supple in the moment, in the present conditions of good and not so good. And as Mignon McLaughlin says, a successful marriage requires falling in love many times, always with the same person. Conclusion, 3 of 100. As I've said, you must truly know one another to transition from syncing to syncing. And what better way than the following activity called 3 of 100. What you'll do is you'll print out and cut the accompanying 100 traits into 100 pieces of paper, each with one trait. Each of you takes a turn deciding what 3 traits are most important to you in life. Okay, to make it easier, you may have a runner-up 3 traits, so a total of 6, since narrowing it down to 3 is quite the challenge. My husband was surprised when one of my top 3 traits was connection. And connection is one of my top three traits. But it was harder earlier in marriage, when in conflict. I truly hope you have realized the ups and downs of conflict in marriage and can find a satisfying place of ever-growing love as you effectively resolve conflict and move toward connection as you create a marriage in sync.